Hello and welcome. Do you make decisions based on fear, or do you look through a lens of possibilities? Or how about how many of us use that fear to prevent us from asking for what we know our child deserves? Well, we're going to be tackling these questions and much more today while we're talking to our guest, Debbie Reber. But first, I want to talk about in today's show what you'll be discovering. So we're going to really focus on reframing from a place of fear to a place of possibilities. And you'll be amazed what a difference that will make for your child. So if I haven't had a chance to meet you before, I'm Charmaine Thaner. I'm a parent, a retired teacher, an advocate, and I love helping parents like you become even more effective advocates for your children. So as I said, today we have a special guest, and she's recently released a new book, and we're going to have a book contest giveaway here. So if you would like a copy of Debbie's book, and let me bring it over. This is my Kindle copy. If you'd like a copy of her Differently Wired, Raising an Exceptional Child in a Conventional World, just type the word brave in the comments and you'll be entered to win. So hopefully my IEP bot will be communicating with you and you'll be all set to have an entry into the contest. So we are really excited because I love being able to interview other parents and get their perspective on what it's like raising their child. And today, Debbie Reber is with us, and she is a parent, a parenting activist, a New York Times bestseller. She also, when she started her career, worked for Blue's Clues on Nickelodeon. So that's so fun. I love watching that even today with my grandkids. So that's a pretty fun fact. But Debbie also has she's a founder of Tilt Parenting, which is a website. She does a weekly podcast. She also has a social media community of people like her that are raising differently wired children. So as we welcome Debbie today, I would encourage you, if you're watching the replay or you are with us live, to type in your comments or any questions that you have. And that way, both Debbie and I can respond to your questions. So welcome, Debbie.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to, the other thing that I forgot to mention is how about 5 years ago, your family moved from Seattle, Washington to Amsterdam. And that's where you're homeschooling your son, Asher, who just is a new teenager.
Yes.
But one of the things I thought was really interesting is how you chose the term differently wired. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, I think that would be great.
Sure. I'm a big believer that the language we use really matters, and that it can frame how we feel about situations. It certainly impacts our kids who are maybe neurologically atypical and who maybe have labels assigned to them that might not really resonate with them. And so as I started developing Tilt Parenting and I was doing all of this work and connecting with lots of parents like me, I was really being thoughtful and intentional about the language that I used. And I found that so much of what existed felt so negative. And, you know, in talking with my son, Asher, who when I founded Tilt was maybe 11 at the time, and he was really involved. And so even as I was naming Tilt, he was putting the kibosh on all kinds of terms that I was coming up with, but differently wired. And I don't know where it first came to me, but I'm sure I must have heard it somewhere before. I didn't make up the term, but I think I've popularized it in the past couple of years. And it just clicked with me because I very much believe that, disorder, there's so much medicalized terminology, and I don't see differences as deficits. I see them as differences that we need to acknowledge and certainly support when we need to support them. But I really like the spin of this just being a matter of fact that some people are wired differently than others. And that's totally fine and perfect.
Oh, exactly. And I think it's wonderful because the more we can get away from that medical model of special education, and I think that really does help us frame differences in a different light. So thank you for being a spokesperson and being out there for that.
Sure.
The other thing I thought was interesting is your choice of the name for your podcast, Tilt Parenting. And I know in your new book, you have 18 different tilts for parents. So before we dive into one of those, if you want to talk about how you came up with that phrase.
Sure. Yeah, I actually get asked this question a lot. People want to know if TILT is an acronym for something, and it's not. And I always say, if you come up with the right words to fit in that work with what TILT's all about, let me know, because maybe it will become an acronym. But there's actually a little story I'll just share behind the name of TILT. And it is that the summer before we moved here, as you said, 5 years ago, we left our home in the US and we moved to the Netherlands. We went to the Jersey Shore with my family. I grew up going to the Jersey Shore, and so it's like my favorite childhood little place to go. And Asher and I went on the ride, the Tilt-A-Whirl. So if, you guys are familiar, that's when you're kind of strapped in and you get whipped around, and you're kind of never know when the next whip is going to happen, and you have to just hold on for dear life. And my husband, my husband took a picture of Asher and I on this ride, and we were both just like holding on, and we had these big grins on our faces, and it just was so indicative of this leap that we were taking and this huge change we were making for our family, and that we just needed to hold on tight and trust and enjoy the ride and know that we're going to get thrown around and that that's just part of it. And so when I started developing what would become TILT, I had lists and lists of names, and I was doing all these brainstorming exercises. And that word TILT, for some reason, I had that picture, as something that I was kind of holding on to. It was on the wall in my office, and it just felt like there's something there. And then I ran it by Asher, who was, as I said earlier, putting the kibosh on a lot of my terminology. And he approved of the name. And so it just worked. And there are so many meanings to it. And then, when I started working on the book, I love this idea that we really do need to tilt our perspective, tilt the way we are thinking about and experiencing our journey with our atypical kids.
So yes, I love that. And I guess that was the picture that I had in mind too. It's just that tilt-a-whirl and how we can kind of flip and change things. And like I mentioned in your book, there's 18 different tilts that you have. And the fifth tilt is what we're going to be talking about today. I thought it would be helpful just to kind of zero in on one of them, even though all of them are exceptional ideas and insights from you. But the one that we're going to be talking about is moving from a place of fear to parenting from the belief in possibilities and knowing that there are enormous opportunities for our children. And how can we switch that up? So I thought what I would do is we can show some of the different key points in that fifth tilt. And one of the first ones that you call is get it all on the table.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, this whole tilt is about the fact that, I believe that we have a choice in how we kind of do everything in our life that we can move forward from a place of love and possibility or a place of fear. And, you know, and this is an idea that Neil Donald Walsh writes about in his book, Conversations with God. And I read it years ago and it just stuck with me. And I found it to be true. You know, you can really assess anything in your life through those two lenses. And so many of us, when we're raising atypical kids, we start to kind of move into this fear zone because there are so many unknowns, and it feels almost safer to stick with fear than choosing possibility. And so this tilt is encouraging readers to get out of that mindset. And in order to do that, you have to, you know, get real about what are your fears. You know, so I actually talk about writing a greatest hits list of all of your fears. And I say in the book, like, I'm talking like the deep, dark, you know, wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, you know, stressed, freak out fears. You have to really understand what are those, you know, deep-rooted fears that we have for our kids, for their future, for what this journey is going to look like. Because until we confront them, you know, we don't want to push them away. We need to bring them out into the light of day because they're affecting us and impacting us always. So this first step of getting it all out on the table is doing just that, making a list, like really getting real with yourself. These are the things, even if they make you feel a little embarrassed, you know, or guilty or whatever it is, just get it all out on the table. We have to name it to tame it.
Yes, I love that. And I wanted to welcome Venus. She was able to see you when you were in New York City on your...
Hi, Venus. Yes.
So that was pretty cool that she got to see you. And then, let's see, Lissa is here from Idaho. So welcome. I'm glad that you were able to make it live. And if you guys, if you're watching, like I said, the live show or the replay, if you can type in some common fears that you've heard from parents or fears that you've had. I know for myself, when my son was born, he had a lot of medical issues. So he was in the NICU nursery. And one of the concerns was whether or not he had Down syndrome. And so when the testing came back and the doctor said, yes, you know, he does have Down syndrome, I remember, I put it in perspective. You know, I can handle my baby having Down syndrome. I can't handle my baby dying. So it was like, we got this as long as we keep him alive here. But I know the two fears that immediately came up for me was one, that he would have to be in this group home when he was an adult. And I had this vision of group homes that I knew about. And it was like, this is not the kind of life that I want for my son. And then my second fear that came up immediately was I was so worried about other kids at school making fun of him. And so, like you said, you have to name that, you have to recognize that. And then that kind of becomes some of your life goals are, I'm going to make sure that this future that I'm worried about isn't going to happen for Dylan. And that we are going to look at ways for him to have great friendships with people and have those natural allies as he goes through school. But I would love to know what maybe some of your fears have been, or what you hear from other parents. And Sarah is with us, and she said that she caught another podcast with you, Debbie, and she loves it. And she loves how you address the terminology, and she thought it was really great. So yeah, if people aren't, subscribe to Debbie's podcast, it's Tilt Parenting, and you will just, be blown away by the different guests that she has and the different topics that she discusses. So Venus says, or getting in an altercation with a bully and getting murdered. And that, unfortunately, for some parents is a founded fear, right? And And that's something that sometimes can just grip us, and we can be frozen in that state. And what Debbie's going to help us do is kind of talk through some alternatives and looking at how can we recognize the fears, and like she said, make that list of your greatest fears, but then also how we can kind of move forward. So Venus also says, my biggest fear is my son getting hit by a car crossing the street.
Me too.
So you know, those are those thoughts that maybe other parents don't have. But for some of our kids that, you know, are kind of impulsive or don't really recognize, you know, the dangers, I mean, those things are like so important that we make sure that the school understands that, you know, when they're in community outings, that the people working with our kids understand those kinds of things, because that safety, that protection is, you know, one of those first needs that we want to make sure gets addressed. So let me see if we have any other comments here. But Lisa says, go ahead.
I was just gonna jump into and say, you know, Venus, that is, you just nailed one of my biggest fears too. The crossing the street, that safety issue. What I just wanted to make sure that we say before we kind of get into more how to address the fears and shift and reframe our thinking a little bit is the harm that can happen when we're moving forward from a place of fear, because fear really keeps us stuck. Fear, you know, makes us make really bad decisions. You know, we're going to choose things that are not rooted in potential. We're not going to choose things that might feel a little riskier that could have incredible payoffs for our kids. You know, our kids will feel fearful energy. Sorry, that was a tongue twister, but they will notice that too. And they feel it, right? These kids are so sensitive and tuned into our energy. And so just like, you know, it will impact how they feel. It's going to create potentially more anxiety for them. So there's so many ways that, you know, and that's not to say that these aren't real concerns. Certainly safety is a huge issue for a lot of our kids, and it is for any parent, but for kids who are kind of heads in the clouds half the time, then it's a real issue. And so I think it's fair to be concerned about those things and make smart choices around how we can protect our kids, but we don't want to awfulize things and go to that dark place and kind of let that dark place, you know, mean that our child's never allowed to leave the house, or, you know, kind of have us make decisions that are ultimately going to hurt our kids.
Right. Oh, I know. And Lisa had a couple of comments. She said, fears that have turned into a realistic reality has been hardest for me to deal with. She said, yes, my fear is of my son in an impulsive moment ends up injuring or killing himself. And so, you know, these are the things, like I said, that, you know, these are the things that, you know, when you're trying to sleep at night, sometimes will prevent a good restful sleep. And I know Lisa as a parent, and I know that she is, you know, actively involved in doing everything that she can to support her son. And I think there are times that you need to maybe find a friend that you can talk to. You know, if you have a spouse or a partner that you can talk to, that can be really helpful. Having these communities of other parents can make a huge difference where we can support each other. But yeah, the reality is a lot of times parents are dealing with, you know, pretty enormous fears. And like you said, our kids pick up on that energy. And that's something that we really need to be aware of. And model for our kids how we can shift. So when our kids are dealing with their own fears, how we can help them understand there's another way that we can shift. And yes, we recognize that. And now let's, what are we going to do about that? And Venus says, yes, these are very deep. Yeah. And I appreciate your vulnerability and your honesty, Venus and Lissa, and the other viewers that we have with us live. And I thank you for opening up and trusting and sharing with us today. Another key point that Debbie has in her fifth tilt is turning those oh no moments around. So Debbie, do you want to talk about how you add some other words and make that a little bit more positive?
Yeah, sure. So I actually interviewed this woman for my podcast, Allison Carmen. I almost said it was Carmen something. She wrote a book called The Gift of Maybe. And I found her when I was researching this book, and I was like, I have to talk with you, because I loved that idea of, just, again, how the language we use can completely change our experience. And so, this is an exercise in that, just noticing when we are framing something from a place of lack or fear or comparison or whatever that is. And so I say, if you can put "oh no" in front of a statement, then it's something you can turn around. So so if the thought is, my child will never graduate high school. If that's one of the fears that made your greatest hits list, or if that's something that you think about regularly, you put the word "oh no" in front of it. Oh no, my child will never graduate high school. That's a sign to you that, okay, I'm operating from this place of fear. And so the way we can turn that around is use words like maybe. And how would we re-say that using the word maybe? We'd say, maybe my child will graduate high school. Maybe he will. We don't know. We have no idea. Like, we can't control the future. We can't control anything, right? Curiosity is my favorite word. I think it's especially when you're raising an atypical kid, being curious is the best thing you can do, because again, we don't know what's going to happen. So if you can bring a curious energy, I am so curious to see what happens with this kid. Like, I'm so curious to see what the rest of his school looks like.
I think we just...
Oh, have I frozen?
Okay, I think we're back live. It's probably that all the way from Amsterdam to the United States, right?
Something.
So I think most of the viewers heard your talk about the oh no, but maybe if you just want to summarize that again, in case we were frozen when they were watching.
Sure. Yeah, I was just saying that if you can put the phrase "oh no" in front of any of your fears or any kind of belief that you have or thought that you have regarding your child, and I talked about, oh no, my child isn't going to graduate from high school. When we're awfulizing or just going to these kind of extreme beliefs, then that's an opportunity to flip it around and to try using words like maybe and curiosity. So maybe, I don't know if you heard this part or not, so I apologize if I'm repeating, but we could say maybe my child will graduate from high school. And even just saying that feels so much different. And you may still, it's not going to erase the fear, but saying, well, maybe, I don't know what's going on. I can't predict the future. It just softens the energy around it. And the same goes with curiosity, which, as I said, is one of my most favorite words. And I think it's so important to have a curious attitude when you're raising an atypical kid, because they're so unique. There's no way we could predict what their path is going to look like. So if we can approach, those same oh no moments with curiosity, like I'm so curious to know what this school journey is going to look like, because it is not what I thought it was going to be. I'm really curious to see where he or she ends up. I'm curious to know if he ends up going to college. I'm curious to know, what his or her career looks like what's she going to end up doing? This is going to be so interesting to watch. You may have to use that language and it may feel a little fake even, but you can fake it till you make it, and just kind of notice when you're using that awfulizing language and try using this terminology, and you will notice that it starts to change your experience. It'll start to change the way that you feel about it.
Oh, I definitely agree. And I know, for some people, those what ifs are some of the things that can maybe keep us up at night. But I like to turn that around, and I like to use the what ifs as far as, wow, what if you could do this, or what if, and have that be a positive phrase and come from that, there's this universal supply of possibilities for our kids. And what if we could do this? What if, or, sometimes when I'm in IEP meetings with families, I'll say, well, what would it take to, and just open that conversation, because that's what we need to do, is to expand our possibility thinking, and not let that fear kind of rule our lives. Yeah. So let's go to our next one, which is a key takeaway in your book, and it says to learn to tune in.
Yeah, I call this kind of my almost like my Oprah moment. Oprah asked that question of her guests, what do you know for sure, right? And it's that big statement in the world. I know for sure that people are inherently good, or whatever it is. And I think it's really great to think about, what do I know for sure about my child? And thinking about from the most positive light, focusing on their strengths, focusing on their gifts. I know for sure that my child is incredibly resilient and creative, and that I've seen such growth, that there's really no stopping this kid, so it takes kind of leaning into that really deep, deep place, because I think when we're operating again from that place of fear, we're kind of caught up in our lizard brain, we're our fight or flight response. We're not tuning into our gut, what we know on a deep, deep, deep level. And if we can connect in with that deep sense of knowing, we can trust that. that is a lot more reliable information than the squirrel that's like chattering in your mind and saying all of these, like, oh my gosh, what if this happens? And what if this happens? So, and it takes effort and time and quiet moments, maybe every day, 2 minutes of just quiet, tuning in to reconnect with that, sense of what you know about your child, no matter what. But that intuition, that really deep sense of knowing that your child is actually exactly who they are supposed to be, and they are perfect as they are. They're creative, they're resourceful, they're whole, they're on their own journey. And our job is to be their guide, their support, all of those things. But the more time we can spend in that place of trust, the more we won't be kind of clinging to that attachment to the what ifs and that fear, and staying in that fear place.
Yeah. And I just keep thinking as you're talking, all of these things that we are learning about ourselves, and, kind of learning how to reframe that. These are all the same things that our kids need to be able to learn. And I know some schools do a really good job of helping kids, go through, like, recognizing their triggers and, recognizing, what are some strategies that you can use at this time. So I just think as parents, when we start learning this and then have conversations with our kids about, this is what I do to help me when I'm in this place. What do you do? And this can be a conversation starter with our kids, because we also want them to recognize the difference of fearful thinking or coming from a place of possibilities. And that will make such a huge difference for our kids and their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, that's such an important point, that we are modeling everything for our kids. They're watching us constantly. And if we can talk out loud about our own process as we're doing this work, even talking out loud about, I noticed that I'm really using this kind of awfulizing language, and I'm going to try to stop doing it. Will you do me a favor if you hear me saying, I can't stand this, or this is terrible, or any of this kind of extreme language, will you remind me that I'm not supposed to be using that anymore? So we can make it even fun, but we can really expose our own journey, and our kids they'll notice. They're going to soak it in and make sense of it, in their own way. So I think it's a great opportunity when our own personal growth spurts can, like, bleed over into our kids' lives.
Oh, exactly. And Sarah is saying that, let me bring up her comment here. She says that my child is exactly who she's supposed to be, and she's perfect just as she is. And that's like this wonderful affirmation that you can be saying to yourself, that your child can be saying to themselves. And yeah, that mindset makes a huge difference in the quality of life that we have, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's, like, super important. And Sarah says that that's a great message. And I know a friend of mine, Kathy Snow, who wrote the book Disability is Natural, talks a lot about, how that's one characteristic of our kids. And we've always had people with disabilities. We always will. And for our kids to realize that difference is a gift, because that does make them unique, and it is okay to be different. So those kind of messages, in what you were saying, Debbie, as far as how important our language is, how our kids hear us talking about them, they are soaking that in. And so we need to really be cognizant of the language that we use when we're talking about our sons or daughters.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next one I like is called Get Your Brave On. So it's not exactly building your muscle that way. But You can do this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, again, when we're in a fear place, we're operating from a sense of deficit or lack or weakness. And we also, I think, as parents with atypical kids, we can feel like we're not equipped, like we don't have what it takes to support this child the way they need to be supported, or this is too hard, or, I just want to stay in this fear place because it feels safer. And I will just say fear does feel safer because it's more known. Yeah. But that's a lie. It's not safer. That's your lizard brain kind of throwing you off course again. But it does require some bravery to confront your fear and to say, okay, I see you. I recognize you're there, and I'm not going to give you that much attention. Like, you can be there doing your little thing, but I'm not going to give in. And that requires some bravery. And so when I say get your brave on, I'm encouraging people to just reflect on times in their life when they have been brave. We all have had situations where we had to be really uncomfortable, step outside our comfort zone, or step up and do something that felt really, really hard. And so when you can, even kind of find one example of a time where you really, showed your bravery, or you leaned into that courage within you, and hold on to that as a reminder that, you do have what it takes. You're strong, you're brave, you're determined, and you can do this.
Yeah. So it would be great if you are with us live or in the replay to type in the comments, like Debbie suggested. Think of an example of when you were really brave. Think about how it turned out in a positive light. For me, I know sometimes it's just, scheduling doctor's appointments for my son, and, having that worry about what the doctor is going to be saying when you get the results for the test. But knowing that this is going to help you move forward, knowing that this is something that's going to be useful. Sometimes it's like, just do it scared, right? And it can be going to meetings at school and being worried about how it's going to come across when you request something that that your child deserves. And, but you do it anyway. You speak up for your child anyway. So it would be great for you guys to give us some examples, of when you've gotten your brave on. And Lisa says, I don't necessarily think fear is always bad. My fears have driven me to advocacy and action and great pre-planning skills for the well-being of my son.
Yeah, Lisa, I love that. And I think fear can be a great, especially if you have like a response, like an emotional reaction to it, that is always a sign like, okay, there's something going on here that I need to pay attention to. So in a way, we can thank our fear. Thanks so much for bringing this to my attention. Thanks for letting me know that I need to do something about this. But I totally agree with you. And that's why I don't advocate like trying to banish the fear. I think that that's something that some people say, I'm just going to ignore the fear and do it anyway. I want you to do it anyway, but I don't think you can ignore the fear because it's not going anywhere. So I talk about making an uneasy alliance with it. I think in the book I write about like, it's kind of like that obnoxious like relative that you have to see at Christmas or something, like you have to interact with them. You just kind of get through it. And we can like create that kind of relationship with fear.
Yes. And like you said, I think that's a helpful way to look at it is like, you recognize it, you thank it for coming up and bringing something to your attention. And then you look at, like Lisa said, what are some steps that I can take now? I recognize this is what I'm worried about. And thank you, because I think when we have that disconnect or that, kind of uneasiness, that's our time where we know we've got some choices, and let's look at the choice that's going to, be the most beneficial for our child. But yeah, I mean, it's not like we can push those feelings down and have them go away. So it's better. I think it's a much more, kind of enlightened way to say thank you when they come up. And now what am I going to do when I feel this way?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah. And Sarah says, all of us who are parents are differently wired, and I think, I think there's things that we have in common, and, we can be there to support each other. So I think that's really helpful. And then you have, another one in this tilt where you talk about just start now.
Yeah, I actually, at the end of every tilt in the book, I have a start now. It's kind of a challenge. I wanted parents reading the book, or caregivers or educators or whoever is interacting with these differently wired kids, to have something that they can do right now to make it actionable. And so the start now challenge for this tilt is to just identify one decision that you're coming up against and just get clear on what's really behind your decision. Whether you're making a pro-con list, it might be an education related thing. Like, am I going to push to get my child into this school program or for this IEP or whatever it is, to really get honest and clear with yourself about whether or not you're making that decision from a lens of fear or through a lens of possibility. And if you recognize that you're doing it through a lens of fear, then try to shift that. And if you do that, it will feel really scary, just to be clear. It can feel really uncomfortable. It can feel reckless sometimes. But don't do it maybe with a huge decision. Start with something small so you can kind of try it out as a baby step. I've been doing this for more years than I can count, and choosing from that place of possibility always works out in the end. It just does. I don't know why, but that's the way the universe goes in my experience. And things just open up. We experience it differently. Our kids experience it differently. So that's my start now challenge, is to just identify one thing that you're thinking, that you're kind of trying to decide, or a place where you're potentially pivoting, but you're not sure what to do, and try to consciously move forward, making a decision through a lens of possibility.
And I think, this is a perfect time of year. I mean, parents are, starting to think about going back to school. I think Venus in New York City, I think they're starting this week or next week. So back to school is here for a lot of for a lot of families. And so looking at your goals for this school year, and, the possibilities of how your child can be successful. I always say, I want to help parents make sure their kids are safe and that they're happy and that they're learning every day at school. So if you can look at one thing that you want to make sure happens this year for your child to be more successful, look at what are those kind of micro steps that you can take now, and start feeling that momentum of taking action, and then that will carry you through so much, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's great advice.
Yeah. So I think, when you mention your book, and we've been talking about the different tilts in your book, I want to see if I can share. Or why don't you just hold up your book? Because I have the Kindle copy, but if you want to hold up your copy.
I don't know if it's backwards or not, but yeah.
No, it actually works good. It's actually good. And if you'd like to get a chance to win a copy of Debbie's book, all you have to do is type in the word brave in the comments, and you'll be entered. And what we'll do is today, Friday, and Saturday, I'll be posting another question in our Facebook group for you to answer. And each time you answer the question, you'll get another entry. The first 5 people who answer the question will get 5 additional entries. And then on Sunday, I'll have either Siri or Alexa pick the winning person, and I'll order you a book and get it shipped off, so you will have it in your mailbox. So I'm excited to be able to share Debbie's book, and I hope it's one that you will recommend to other parents. She has such insightful wisdom that, it's a book that you can pick up and you can start reading in any place and find some words of encouragement and support. So I really appreciate that you have, spent the time researching and talking to so many parents, Debbie, when you wrote this book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those kind words. And it was the hardest book I've ever written, for sure. I felt I wanted to get it right. I put a lot of pressure on myself because I see that we're at a sea change in terms of changing this conversation for our kids, because I think they just deserve so much more in terms of the way they're experiencing their childhoods and how they're being perceived by so many in society and the education system, and on and on and on. So I really wanted to get this right, and I'm really excited by the response. And it's been so great to connect. Like, getting to talk to all the parents I interviewed for this book was a gift to me, because I got to have these amazing conversations with the most, I said it was the bravest parents you'll ever meet. And it was a real honor to do.
Well, that's great. And I know you have your website, so that's tiltparenting.com, right?
Yes.
And your weekly podcast, and that's on iTunes. Mm-hmm. I would encourage people to subscribe to Debbie's podcast. And I know you have one that you are doing with your husband coming up. So do you want to tell us about that?
Yes, sure. So he's been on the podcast one time in 118 episodes, and it was a while ago. It was episode 56, and we just had a conversation where we shared very intimately what we've gone through as a couple in trying to get on the same page, because we weren't for a long time. And so when I was doing the book tour, that was something that came up really in every stop. And then as I've been doing conversations and book club groups and talking to more and more parents, this always comes up. What if my partner's not on the same page? I know not everyone's co-parenting in the same home, but or even with an ex, how do I get them on the same page? How do I get them interested in all of this stuff? So I've asked my husband if he will come back on the show, and he said yes. So I don't know if he knows what he's in for, but I will be recording it next week. So I've invited people to send me questions. So you can email me at debbie@tiltparenting.com if you have a question that you want us to answer together, or specifically for Darren. He's pretty in tune with himself, and he'll go there. He'll be very vulnerable, I'm sure, in this conversation. So we might get some good insight from him that would be helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's a topic that doesn't get discussed much, but is something that is a common kind of, underlying kind of emotion, or, just this, you feel it in the room, kind of the elephant in the room. Mm-hmm. And so I think with your podcast with your husband, that will give people permission and maybe some conversation starters to mm-hmm. use with their spouse or partner, so they can begin that conversation. Because just like when we were talking about how kids pick up on our anxieties and our worries, and kids also pick up when there's, a disconnect between what the parents are doing. So that'll be a great broadcast.
Yeah. And I think I'll just say it's really important work to do, because the longer we let it go on without, at least investing in trying to get more in alignment with our partner, the more off track we can get. And the bigger that divide grows, the harder it is to bring back. So it's not easy work to do if you're not on the same page, and especially if your partner just really isn't even close to being there. But I think there are ways that we can design an alliance with them, or at least to feel more at peace with the way, we are kind of co-parenting.
Right. And so Lisa asks, how do you find your podcast?
So a couple places. It's on Apple Podcasts. That's where if you can subscribe there. And then if you go to my website, tiltparenting.com/podcast, they're all there. They are organized. You can search by topic, so school or ADHD or anxiety or whatever, homeschooling, whatever it is. And you'll also just be able to get a list of those. But you can scroll down and you can just kind of see what's there and just click and play it from my website as well.
Okay, and I'll come back in our post and I'll put the links for Debbie's website and the link for her podcast. So then that'll be easy for parents to just click there. So she says, okay, thanks. And Susan is with us from Denver, and she says, great point of having partners on the same page. I've been so lucky. My husband is so much involved with our son's everything every day.
So maybe we should talk to your husband for the podcast. That's awesome. That's great.
I know.
I know.
Awesome. Yeah. So this has been a wonderful time. I am so happy that we were able to connect, Debbie. And I've just really enjoyed reading your book. I've been in the book club, but I seem to always be catching the replays of your book club podcast. Or Zoom meetings, but I just think that what you have to say to parents resonates with how they are feeling. It helps so much to be reminded how we can reframe our thinking and move on a more positive path while recognizing our fears, but moving forward and doing something to start now. So I so appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I love doing this, and I really loved having this conversation with you and with everybody. Yeah, thank you.
It's great. And as I said, if you're watching the replay, come back and write comments and questions, and we'll respond to those. We are live every Thursday at noon Mountain Time. Next week, my guest is Sue Swenson, who is the president of Inclusion International. And Sue has been in the field of education and advocating for students with disabilities for a number of years. She's a parent. She also worked in the Federal Department of Education. And we're going to be talking about how to create systemic change in our public schools, which is certainly needed. And so I'm excited that Sue Swenson will be joining us next week. So I encourage you to put Thursdays on your calendar, and you can join us each week for another live broadcast. So until next week, I'm Charmaine Thaner, and I'm passionate about helping you become an even better advocate for your child. So until then, take care and bye-bye.